As part of the NYU School of Professional Studies, the Center for Global Affairs welcomes you to today's conversation, Modern World, Modern Threats, Responses to Hybrid Aggression. We are always wise after an event, but rarely are emerging threats properly identified or understood with tragic consequences. What is the greatest threat to the global order in our way of life? Armed conflicts such as Russia's annexation of Crimea and its armed intervention in the Ukraine and the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Or complex and diffuse challenges such as the drug trade, cybercrime, and the displacement of whole populations. It is our moral obligation to dedicate resources to the study of these complex and developing threats and to the evolution of sophisticated intervention strategies in response. The NYU School of Professional Studies is proud to introduce the Initiative for the Study of Emerging Threats at the Center for Global Affairs, which will be known as ICET. ICET's research, driven by faculty, students, and affiliates, will contribute to understanding and prediction of new security threats toward the formation of preemptive responses. ICET's director, our honorable faculty, Mark Galeotti, is our host for today's conversation and will lead this new initiative. Mark and his accomplishments are great. He is a clinical professor of global affairs. He is the academic director of the Transnational Security Concentration of the MS in Global Affairs program. He's been a specialist in transnational organized crime, security, and affairs in modern Russia. He has served as the advisor to the British Foreign Office, worked with a wide range of commercial law enforcement and government agencies from the State Department to Interpol. Under his leadership, ICET will focus on the study of such non-traditional threats as transnational crime, corruption, the changing face of war, its overlap with terrorism, and insurgency, information warfare as well. Please join me in a round of applause in welcoming Mark Galeotti to the stage. In addition, we are incredibly honored to welcome Toomas Hendrik Ilves, President of the Republic of Estonia, a noted expert and author in several fields from cyber security and e-government to transatlantic relations and Russian policy on NATO and the Baltic. Previously, he served in Washington, D.C. as the ambassador of the Republic of Estonia to the United States of America and Canada. And before that, he was Estonia's Minister of Foreign Affairs. He has also served as a member of the Estonian Parliament and a member of the European Parliament, where he was Vice President for the Foreign Affairs Committee. During this time, he initiated the Baltic Sea Strategy that was implemented as the European Union's official regional policy. He was initially elected President of the Republic of Estonia in 2006 and re-elected for a second term in office in 2011. Please join me in a round of applause. And now, without further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Mark Galeotti and Professor Toomas as we embark on tonight's conversation. Thank you.
Hopefully these mics are on. Okay, well, let's start. And let's be honest, there is a 600-pound gorilla in the room, and the gorilla has no shirt on. He is, of course, President Putin, and his speech today. So let's start with that. This was his big address to the UN, the first time he's been there for 10 years. What did you read from that? What did you get a sense of what he was looking for?
I would say trying to get out of the mess he's in by shifting attention to other issues would be the first thing. I mean, basically, much of it was devoted to combating ISIS, which clearly would find a resonance in the liberal democratic West, but the solution to it was kind of, let's forget all this other stuff and I'm not going to do anything about it. So I mean, what has occupied the minds of people in Europe and in the United States has been, this is the complete, well, I'd say, I don't know if collapse, but certainly the disintegration of the post-World War II order, beginning with the UN Charter forbidding aggression, the cornerstone of peace and security in the West, the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which again forbids the use of force to change borders and also foresees the right of every country to choose its own alliances, reiterated again in the 1990 Paris Charter, and not to mention then, though not a treaty, but the Budapest Memorandum in which the UK, the United States, and the Russian Federation agreed to preserve and maintain the territorial integrity of Ukraine in response, or in return for the elimination of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And it's always important to keep in mind they were the third largest nuclear power in the world after 1991. So it's as if, let's not talk about that. Let's not concentrate too much on the fact that the security order has fundamentally changed. Well, I mean, here it is. You're playing off one serious threat, which is not only ISIS, but what is confronting Europe today, which is a massive inundation of the European Union, the European space, by people fleeing violence in Syria. And there's no real end in sight with 1.5 million refugees in Lebanon, another 1 million something in Turkey. I mean, so we've already had basically 1 million people in this year streaming across the Mediterranean or across the Turkish-Bulgarian border into Europe, heading mainly for countries like Germany and Sweden, but also massively to Italy. So, I mean, clearly this is a different security threat. And I think there is a strong, there are people who say, well, okay, this is what's directly affecting us. Why not make a deal? Well, we'll see what happens. But clearly his whole approach in his speech really was to ignore all of those violations of the basis of security in the West for the past 70 years. And to basically, by claiming, instead of what I enumerated, so the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act, I mean, he actually claimed this genesis in the Yalta Agreement, which, I mean, Joseph Stalin's division of Europe is something which he claims is the basis of security. It is, I mean, if you recall, the Yalta Agreement basically says, well, you guys get these countries, we get these countries. And that's been a pretty significant message all along in terms of spheres of influence, droit de regard, regarding the behavior of, or the choices of countries along Russia's borders since 1991. It's just, it's getting stronger and stronger.
Okay. Accepting the bad stuff, and we'll come on to the bad stuff in a minute, let's just try and look. If this is meant to be a deal, do you feel that Putin actually can offer anything? And do you feel there is actually any scope for a meaningful dialogue on security in Europe?
Well, I think what he can offer, ground troops in Syria, that he can offer. But certainly I do not see the European Union or NATO really agreeing to anything that would say, okay, it was okay to invade and occupy Crimea, that it is okay to have your ground troops in a sovereign country in the Donbass. I don't see anyone acquiescing on that, but given the fears of a number of countries about ISIS, al-Nusra is not exactly a fun bunch either, and Saddam, or rather Assad. Yeah, I get my Mideast wars confused here. Assad, I mean, I think there are those who say, well, let him do it. I mean, we in Europe, we don't want to commit ground troops. We don't want to get involved there, which, I mean, that's kind of a widespread attitude. So let him send his troops there. So I think there is some of that there.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, Donald Trump here in the States, that touchstone of forward-thinking foreign policy. Okay, so in theory, Putin could offer ground troops, though, frankly, his deployable ground troops are pretty much currently already busy in a little war closer to home, and long-range power projection isn't something that the Russians are very good at.
Well, they've been practicing a lot in the last 2-3 years.
They have been practicing, but I don't think they're willing to kind of surrender their current stamping grounds for going to Syria instead. Actually, what it comes back to is, yes, of course, there are going to be some voices that are seduced by the immediate convenience. Just as, let's be honest, initially the Russians were quite happy about the rise of Islamic State because it drained radicals away from the North Caucasus, and it meant terrorism went down in the short term, and they thought, great, all these radicals, they can go into the Middle East and the Americans can kill them. And I remember actually having a conversation with a Russian security officer who was actually complaining that the Americans weren't good enough at killing Russian radicals. So now, in a way, we can be seduced by the flip side. Oh, it'd be nice, ISIS, Russians, let them kill each other or whatever. But, I mean, in practice, do you think there is any real likelihood that this actually could become a grand bargain?
Well, I can't speak for all of the countries in Europe, and there are probably some that would, I mean, I think closer you are to the action, maybe the more appealing it would be. On the other hand, I mean, I'm sure you did see the story, since it's your area, but about the kontraktniki, or the contract soldiers, who were perfectly happy to go fight in an illegal war in the Donbass, but who refused to be sent to Syria. So I think that there is, I don't know, the kind of I mean, the idea of going to a dry, desert-like Muslim country might reverberate with people in Russia today after the ignominious defeat in Afghanistan. I think that people haven't forgotten that. Mm-hmm. So I think it isn't as probably, it won't be a good little war for Russia to go in there.
Mm. No, it's very hard to see I mean, policymakers always like to feel that they can control them, but in fact they tend to get sucked into them. Okay, so let's focus less on, as it were, the seeming olive branch, even if it's sort of an olive branch that's been wielded as a stick, and actually look at the Russian threat. I mean, Estonia, quite literally the frontline state in the current campaign. I mean, you just had the case of one of your security officers who was kidnapped in a cross-border raid, has just been swapped for a Russian spy who had been found guilty in a genuine court of being a spy. Give us a sense of how you see this threat. I mean, is what, if anything, keeps you up at night? Is it the thought of Russian tanks rumbling your way, or what?
Well, I mean, we have to look at sort of, just that because we're neighbors of Russia doesn't really mean that we are in the same position as other countries. I mean, we are members of the NATO alliance. So that's a very different position from where Ukraine is. And so that is already a much different bargain.
Of course.
Or a much different situation in which you always have the risk that were you to do something in Estonia that at least would be sort of overtly military, that this would in fact cause much greater problems. Clearly it is countries like mine, I don't mean only mine, but countries that don't toe the line in foreign policy, that is, they don't sort of, well, they're members of NATO, they're in the European Union, that's not to the liking of the overall foreign policy view, which is it was always to control your neighbors. And I think it was George Kennan said in the long telegram, I mean, the goal of Russian or Soviet foreign policy is that its neighbors must either be vassals or enemies. And that, unfortunately, I think was a very accurate statement that continues to this day. But I don't really see that happening at this point. Because, first of all, the NATO is a rather formidable entity. And immediately someone say, well, would the U.S. go die for Narva? Well, I think that's always the possibility. And I think for those, I don't think you want to risk that. Let's go take a slice of a neighbor and see what happens if that is a NATO member. Clearly, in the case of Ukraine, they took that risk. But I also think that the response by both the European Union and the United States and Canada already in terms of sanctions to a country, or to the invasion and annexation of a country that, or parts of a country that are neither European Union members nor in the alliance, would give you pause to actually go do something serious with countries that are a member of both. I mean, already from the point of view of Estonia being having the common currency of the European Union, that already, I think you would then have to deal with, you know, Frankfurt and the central bank. So I'm not as nervous as some people who think it's fun to write articles on these topics are.
But let's push, though, I mean, on the other hand, Russia is, I think it's fair to say, an uncomfortable neighbour.
Absolutely.
For Estonia, or and for other NATO countries.
You don't have to be on the border to be uncomfortable.
True. Though, I mean, I think in Britain, the greatest discomfort is how it's driving up the house prices in London.
Well, that's true.
But I mean, I'm thinking about sort of, you know, there's issues, again, I mean, across you know, a variety of sort of Central European countries. There are concerns about intelligence operations, about financial penetration, potentially of strategic industries, and just generally sort of uncertain and dirty money sloshing in, whether it's buying up property or backing potentially problematic political movements.
I would say the latter is actually one of the things that does get me worried, because we have seen in the past several years the rise of really not very nice, hardcore right-wing parties that are neo-fascist, that are racist, that are deny sort of the liberal order, that are quite clearly being funded by Moscow. I mean, the most egregious case, which we know publicly, is Marie Le Pen's Front National, a really very, very sort of out there party that got at least 9 million euros, so that's basically, you know, over $10 million. I mean, $10 million for a party is not that big. That's a lot of money. And there are suspicions of similar kinds of things. We see also the coalition party of the main party in Greece, Syriza's coalition party, which is again a very hardcore, sort of dubious party that is very much in together with, goes to and organizes seminars with Alexander Dugin. We can argue whether Dugin is a force or not, but he's certainly not very savory in terms of his views. So we see that. I see that more than, say, the spying. Well, we're pretty good at capturing that. And we're doing more than anyone else, have done better than anyone else, maybe. Yes, that is a problem. And clearly, all kinds of funny things have happened in Europe in the last 10, 12 years with money. I mean, the former Chancellor of Germany pushed through, while in office, a gas pipeline deal, which was kept secret from other EU members, including us. And then after it got through, went to work for Gazprom. I mean, I would say that's one of the worst cases of corruption since Krupp before 1940. that gets me worried. But as I said, when you see the rise of really very nasty parties in Europe, which was, I mean, a phenomenon that was missing from the end of World War II till recently, we really didn't see that in Europe.
In many ways, you're actually sounding tremendously relaxed. Because precisely as you say,
jet-lagged.
well, it's fine. You know, thank God for the hours difference. No, because you mentioned people writing articles. I mean, there is a sometimes faintly hysterical tone.
Yeah.
I mean, and in the United States, we've had generals talking about Russia as the sort of greatest military threat to the United States, an existential threat, and so forth. And I can't help but feel that that actually plays to Putin's advantage.
Good.
A relatively weak economy, a large but in many ways not very usable military. I mean, yes, he has nukes, that's fine, but in many ways Putin is actually essentially playing a political game. I mean, do you feel that, again, linking it back to him being here today, I mean, do you feel that Putin is effective in using the whole bluff and propaganda?
Domestically. I mean, I think domestically it works, and because there are no alternative outlets, or, I mean, the things that are available, they're really, I mean, Novaya Gazeta has, I mean, a readership of a few thousand or maybe tens of thousand people out of a country of 140 million. Probably doesn't have much impact. I mean, the only really decent television program now comes out of Riga, Latvia, and it's visible only, I mean, you can see it only on the internet. So, I mean, I think there is a fair monopoly of truth, and you see people who have alternative views quickly get fired. And so, domestically, yes. I mean, it's quite amazing to see this kind of, the effectiveness domestically, and which has been extreme, at least from reading polls, seems to be quite resilient to the quite clear economic decline in the last year and a half. And then you read articles saying, well, this is the ever-suffering Russian nation that will put up with this. On the other hand, it really is not working abroad. If you look at the Pew study of sort of attitudes towards, I mean, all kinds of countries, but I mean, you look at Germany, which was 2 years ago overwhelmingly sort of positive view of Russia among the German public. Today, it's appallingly low. So I don't think it's been effective abroad.
But that's soft power. That's, we will give Russia its way because we like it. We like the Russians. We like that nice Mr. Putin. And yes, absolutely. I think it's fair to say that Putin has decided not to try and build up soft power. Invading neighbouring countries tends anyway to sort of somewhat damage that.
Yes.
But instead, I mean, there is this. I mean, when it comes down to it, we're talking about a country with an economy somewhere between that of Brazil and Italy.
Lower than Italy.
Yeah.
But it's just that Brazil has a large population. Italy's 67 million, so it's.
Exactly. I mean, this is not a country which, under normal circumstances, we would regard as a great world power, and yet, and in part for legacy reasons, like a seat on the Security Council and you know, nuclear weapons, which even if they're not usable, they catch our attention whenever he says we're going to move nuclear missiles into Kaliningrad or whatever. But one way or the other, nonetheless, you know, Putin is being able to shape the conversation. That's the sort of the jargon way of putting it these days. Should this be considered to be a success? Or actually, is he just leveraging himself further and further over a precipice, do you think?
Well, first of all, I say he's been amazingly effective at actually leveraging 140 million people with a fairly backward economy into a much greater position of strength than he would in some other case. And I mean, if you compare it to Brazil, which has twice the population and is a dynamic country with growing population and clearly will be one of the major powers in, if not already, but will be, and you can predict that the vibrancy of that society is going to take Brazil rather far. Right, he's done well in that sense. On the other hand, how sustainable it is, I don't know. I mean, the other difference with Brazil, of course, is that, which is always the advantage of democracies, is that the real democracy, the advantage of democracy is that you have an orderly transfer of power. And I think one of the problems that sort of underlies a lot of the behavior that we see is this concern that, you know, what happens when you're not, when you're no longer in power, so you better stay in power. And this is why I've said occasionally in the past, this is your area as well, but I mean, I think the Mario Puzo is one of the great Sovietologists or Russian experts of all time, the late, great Mario Puzo. And I think if you, even for over last Christmas, my son, adult son, we came home and discussing this, so we'd actually downloaded Godfather 1 and Godfather 2 just to sort of figure out what's going on in Russia.
Well, to be honest, not watching Godfather 3 was a good move. Okay, well, while we're talking about crime, I mean, Estonia is, after all, you know, world leader in e-government. You have this sort of innovative e-citizenship. I mean, I'm a proud Estonian e-citizen, which I suppose makes you my e-president.
Resident.
E-resident, sorry. How about cybercrime? I mean, is that, as it were, a frictional problem of the modern age? Or is it something that, again, can be properly weaponized and deployed?
Well, it certainly can be. I mean, if you read Misha Glenny's book, Dark Market, which is about cybercrime, mainly credit card theft, but I mean, there he actually found an agreement, curiously enough, between the FSB, which is a Russian, the successor to the KGB, that, and a credit card theft ring in Ukraine, which should be outside of the purview of the FSB, theoretically. And the agreement has three parts to it. One is that the credit card ring will not steal any credit cards from people in the CIS, that is, the former Soviet Union minus the Baltic countries. Number two, the FSB will not prosecute anyone convicted, or I mean, will prosecute anyone who is engaged in cybercrime in the rest of the world. And then part three was that we will, the criminal gang agrees to offer its skills and resources to the FSB should the need ever arise. And we saw this with the cyber attacks, which at this point, looking back, were on Estonia, which were, I mean, they were the first of its kind. I mean, the kinds of attacks, I mean, it's called a DDoS attack, distributed denial of service attack, which sort of shuts down, overloads sites. And they had been seen before. They've been used in extortion against internet companies that require web pages. It had never been done at a political level, to our knowledge. Clearly, that was not a state-run operation. They were using botnets. I mean, the same people, if you think of it this way, if you get these Viagra ads all the time or whatever, these spam things, that they're computers that are sending them millions of messages out throughout the day. And so what you can do is you can just turn it around and direct all of those messages towards one site, and then you frizzle them, and they're just overloaded. And that's been used had been used in the past, for example, against Gary Kasparov's California-based server. I mean, it's been done, but it was now toward a country. I mean, it can be used, and it is a unique form of public-private partnership to use these kind of mafia, organized crime, botnets, again, for, I mean, you rent them, basically. Well, I mean, I think it's a model that we see all over, and again, it's your specialty. You see this kind of sort of state power intermingling with organized crime. I think it probably had, I think what we had in the case of our, I guess you call him the FBI agent who was abducted. I mean, what was he doing? He was not, they don't spy. He was dealing with a with a cigarette smuggling ring, and to see the response, which was basically a military response to actually grab this guy and being shipped up to Moscow within 12 hours, or down to Moscow and put into a KGB prison. I mean, the only deduction I can make from that is that the organized crime he was investigating, which clearly was organized crime, because it was massive sort of inundation of cheap cigarettes ever since we raised our cigarette excise taxes. But if you can organize a military action, have the guy end up 12 hours later in a prison in Moscow, then he probably was investigating something that was a little too sensitive for someone high up. Because it was just a local thing, kind of the guy across the border who was making extra bucks or something. But this was clearly touched a raw nerve somewhere. So this intermingling between sort of criminal behavior and state structures, or at least criminal rings that can mobilize state structures to have a military response. I mean, I think it's a problem we face sort of more broadly.
But it is one, definitely, that the Russians are particularly good and assiduous at doing. I mean, we saw in annexation of Crimea, alongside the polite people, the Russian special forces, there were the sort of thuggish gunmen from local organized crime. We see that Ukrainian gangsters and Russian gangsters still today are cooperating perfectly happily.
Right. Well, in fact, a lot of the people who were installed in Crimea initially were really part of the local mafioso. But this is already, we saw that in Ossetia, where basically Ossetia had, its sort of de facto government was just the local crime boss.
So, in some ways, this then sounds like it is one of the Russian strengths. Just putting together, whether it's shopping for hackers, or whether it's conveniently irritating political parties in other countries, or conveniently irritating dictators in other parts of the world. In a way, the Russian strength seems to be precisely that they do see the world as a buffet, and they can just simply pick whatever is, for the moment, convenient and useful. They don't expect loyalty, they don't expect love. They pay for it, whether it's in money or in access or in one other thing. This is it. Isn't this in some ways the issue that we've moved from a Cold War in which, however cynical and corrupt and self-serving the Soviet leadership was, there was at least an ideology that underpinned it and constrained it. Now it's an entirely, I hesitate to use the word postmodern, but certainly unstructured sort of challenge that is just precisely they'll just go for whatever is convenient.
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that, the kind of this sort of mafia state structure sort of symbiosis has been remarked upon far earlier. We see it more today, but we had Mafia State by the Guardian, Luke Harding wrote it.
Luke Harding.
And David Satter already before that, investigating the bombings in Ryazan. So it's been around. I think we're just seeing it more. Initially,
but again, that was much more internal. What we're now seeing is much more they're using the world as their buffet, rather than just simply looking for assets.
Well, I think Gerhard Schröder is an example of kind of going. It's not that thuggish, it's just bribery, but probably be called into London court by saying that, but anyway. There is no overt ideology, but there's certainly, you can say, this kind of, I don't know what you would call it. The Dugin, sort of great Russia, very strong emphasis on kind of this, on what they would call conservatism, but sort of anti-liberal democracy, anti-gay. That sort of the decadent West of, it's painting this picture of the decadent West, that equating liberal democracy with gay rights. And this is the term gay Europa to talk about Europe. I mean, certainly there's a strong element of that, and then perhaps even more deeply is, I mean, I think it's interesting, though, of course we can argue whether Dugin is marginal or not, but I mean, a man who was translated and published in Russia the complete works of Carl Schmitt, who was the kind of I mean, he was a real thinker. Unfortunately, he was a Nazi thinker, but I mean, in the sense of he was philosophically astute, and Leo Strauss wrote his first paper ever about Carl Schmitt, the concept of the political. I mean, and where he, in fact, came up with this idea that was used by the Nazis, which is as an alternative to liberal democracy, it's us versus them. And it's the Feindbild, the enemy of the picture of the enemy that you have to produce. And that's what politics is about. And then when you see groups like Nashi, Krim Nash is a slogan. I mean, it really is sort of redefining politics as us versus them. You do it in international affairs, but you also do it domestically. I mean, your guys are Nashi, and then they go around sort of terrorizing people in your country who have different views. I think that it's, I mean, the ideological basis is there, or at least it's being instrumentalized, if not propagated.
Sure, sure. Though obviously when they start, I don't know, supporting Texas separatists and so forth, it's not because they feel a loamy regard for Texan feelings or anything like that. It's just, this is a nice way of just sticking a finger in America's eye.
But that's a lot of what is being done. I mean, it's just basically sort of being an irritant.
Yeah.
I mean, they're doing a good job. I don't know.
Right, you heard it here, folks. Putin's doing a good job of being an irritant. One last question, because then I would like to throw it open to questions and comments from the audience. To sort of wrap this up, I mean, clearly at the moment, Ukraine is the sort of the crux of the European sort of security challenge or whatever. Is there anything, whether it's in, I mean, I must admit, I struggled to find much that was hopeful in Putin's speech, especially when he started with the military coup that organized from outside that brought down the previous regime. But I mean, putting that aside, are there any grounds you think for hope? Where do you think a resolution could lie?
Well,
no pressure.
I mean, I don't know about Ukraine, but I think essentially if eventually, I remain Fukuyaman. I think that basically people want to have a liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. That there is no ideal. I mean, Fukuyama claimed 26 years ago that there's no more ideological battle. Mm-hmm. I mean, then people sort of go, well, but look at China, look at all this. Well, yeah, but there is no ideological battle. People we see ultimately want to live in a democracy of some form or another. Ukraine is a perfect example of that. I mean, everyone said, oh, Ukraine is hopeless. But in fact, ultimately, people said, enough. I think eventually in Russia, people say, enough. The alternative is that all the smart people will leave, which is what is happening right now, too. I mean, a brain drain is horrible. I mean, in my country, liberal Russians are moving to Estonia. I mean, if you have money, you move to London or Paris, or the United States. If you're a middle-class professor who just lost his job because he said something that was critical, what are you going to do? I mean, you don't really, where are you going to go? I mean, you're going to go to a country where, in fact, you can use Russian, and where, in fact, you can say what you want. So we're getting people moving to us, and then the ones who have more money can move to richer countries. So ultimately, I mean, you don't want all the smart people in your country to leave and have them replaced by has-been French movie stars.
Or indeed American movie stars. I mean, that's true. And I spent, 4 weeks this summer there, and even people who were clearly still enthralled to Putin and the whole myth of how Putin is presented, no one actually said, look, I really don't want any of this messy need to express an opinion. I would much rather just simply some hereditary monarchy sort of looked after me or whatever. I mean, basically people have a desire for what they call a normal life, and which,
it's not only
democracy is
freedom of
good at
speech. I
creating.
mean, the other side is due process.
Mhm.
I mean, I think this is something that is often ignored because, we people like us like to talk only about freedom of speech, but due process. I mean, contract law. I mean, knowing that you have recourse to honest courts if someone has done something to you or taken over your company. I mean, that is really for democracy to be successful if you have due process. I mean, Prussia was a good example of a country which, had, the 19th century Germany. It wasn't very democratic, but it was, nonetheless, it was successful in that at least you could count on the courts and the legal system. And there are a number of countries where, okay, they may be not so good always on freedom of speech, but the courts work. But you don't have that either. And I think that perhaps might upset a lot of other people who may care less about the right to criticize their country's rulers, but they'll take over from a mafia group and they can't do anything about it because the courts won't defend you. That also is, I think, a far greater source of people's disillusionment. And then the third element, which we often forget, is we're very Moscow ring road centric. The regions are in trouble. The regions are unhappy. Many of the regions are on the verge of bankruptcy. So all of these problems which are accumulating and sort of obscured by the fact that we look at speeches at the UN and sort of hostile, aggressive rhetoric, we should also look at what else is happening.
So, I mean, you have sort of elegantly stepped round and delineated, but if I can be sort of less elegant, you see the hope in the fact that Putin can't last forever, and this regime can't last forever. And but basically, so long as this regime is in place, presumably there can be tactical shifts, but nothing truly substantive. Is that a fair comment?
Well, I don't anticipate massive economic growth.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're seeing a slow decline, and that's certainly, I think, very unfortunate for a country that has done so much, over 1,000 years, to see it right now, ultimately, for a small group, in the name of keeping in power and enriching a small group of people, is leading the country down to a road to ruin. And I mean, it's not as if that's not happened before. I mean, I think Argentina is still struggling to get over the Perón legacy. Mm-hmm. I mean, so it's not as if it's a completely unique case.
But of course, Argentina didn't have nukes, and from our point of view, Argentina wasn't a European country. I mean, which is a terrible observation.
I think Argentinians thought they were more European.
But the point is, it is there. It is newsworthy. I mean, Russia is a European country and an Asian country.
I mean, Argentina was like in the top 5 or 6 countries in GDP per capita in the 1920s, and then it just sort of went downhill.
Sure. But I mean, in terms of sort of, as it were, the current challenge,
right.
What happens in Russia has an immediate impact. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to now open it out to questions and comments from the audience. I would just simply say, I mean, obviously, wait until someone with a mic comes to you before asking your question. Try and keep it short. And I know there is the temptation to, I'll make a statement, but then I'll just simply tack on would you like to comment? As a way of turning that. Fair enough. But if you're going to do that, make the statement short. And then when you made your statement, if you can hand back the mic to whoever's given it so it can be ready for the next person. So I can see a hand already up, right at the back there in white shirt.
Yeah. Good evening, Mr. President. My name is Albert Golson. Could you comment on the possibility that with the huge influx of humanity coming in from the Middle East, that voters in Europe might tend to vote more conservatively or even right-wing in the upcoming elections? France has a big one coming up in 2017, as well as other European countries. If Europe should go very conservative or even somewhat right-wing within the EU. How does that change the dynamics between Europe, the United States, and with Russia?
Well, you got elections coming up too, so I don't know. Well, I mean, first of all, it is clear that that in most countries, the hard right has experienced a rise in popularity. The 25% of the French representatives in the European Parliament in the elections in 2014, was it 2014, yeah, came from Le Pen's party, which is, I mean, sent shockwaves throughout Europe. So I think there will be much greater, there will be far more people with strong anti-immigrant positions in government as well as in parliaments. I see sort of standard center-right parties, the equivalent of kind of like the Republicans in the United States, adopting in Europe far harsher positions because they're afraid to lose that vote to the hardcore right. Now, I mean, that's a real threat. I mean, I can't really speculate on how it'll turn out, but it is, I think, worrisome for people. And we saw, I mean, there are a number of really nasty parties in Europe right now that seem to be gaining in popularity. You know, that wear uniforms and take anti-Semitic positions or anti-immigrant positions in a kind of semi-violent way. So, I mean, I'm worried.
Just actually a little side question onto that. I mean, we know that the Russians from time to time have been supporting various of these groups because they're divisive, because they cause trouble. Actually, though, would a Europe that was rather more gripped by ultra-right-wing, ultra-nationalist parties actually be a more comfortable Russia or not?
Well, certainly if you look at the positions of a number of these parties, they tend to be pro-Russian, anti-NATO. I mean, that's the other side. I mean, it's a lot of these parties, I mean, we'll take Front National, I mean, they are strongly anti-NATO and would rather have France be out of NATO. And you can see across Europe, I mean, the kinds of parties that adopt these very hard right-wing positions, curiously enough, are not very transatlantic. And in anything, they're also anti-American.
Yep, you, second. And then the chap in front can be next.
Mr. President, thank you for taking my question. I wanted to ask a follow-up on a question the professor asked, and maybe perhaps sharpen it a little bit, three-pronged. Do you fear the possibility of a Russian invasion? Are you preparing for that? And do you feel confident in that in such a horrible scenario that NATO and the United States in particular would come to your aid? Thank you.
Well, I don't really anticipate anything like that right now. Well, we are, in terms of what we're doing to prepare, we have been for quite a while one of the very, very few countries in NATO that actually does spend the agreed upon 2% of GDP on defense that everyone in NATO has agreed to, but it's currently only Estonia, the UK, and Poland and Greece, though the last country doesn't ever do anything outside of Greece. It's kind of but I mean, at least of the countries, I mean, that's a very small minority of countries in Europe, in NATO, that actually spend on defense. And so the last question is, what happens if, I'm really not worried about NATO not doing what it needs to do, precisely because as soon as NATO fails, NATO's over. Which means that, okay, what would be a possible scenario that NATO would fail? Well, say country X in the Mediterranean says, no, we won't do it. Well, I don't think that is possible, or we won't support going to a fellow NATO member's assistance because, in fact, you know that after that, no one's going to come to your assistance either. And I mean, and it is in the interest of every government in NATO to be in NATO, to have that security shield, because that once it's gone, it's gone. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind, because especially when you get all these articles about is Narva next or something, which comes more from alliteration than anything else, but Narva's an Estonian city on the border. There's a long way from say, from something, I mean, from a response to, say, an incursion to nuclear war. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, we already saw what the sanctions have done. We haven't even gone sort of so-called nuclear on that. I mean, all the United States has to do is turn off SWIFT. And in 48 hours, there's nothing left of the economy. I mean, if you turn off SWIFT to the Russians, you don't need a nuclear war. You don't even need a major military invention. You just turn off SWIFT and the economy is gone. I mean, so the range of responses is far greater than all or nothing. Someone attacks and we launch nuclear missiles against Petersburg, Moscow, and Yekaterinburg. I mean, I think this is part of the mistake made in thinking about the security dilemma. That it's not like a binary decision. There are just many, many gradations, and I think that's always taken into the calculus on the part of people who think about military issues.
And the Czech shirt.
Thank you, Mr. President. I didn't come here to be an apologist of Putin or Putinism, if there is such a thing, but don't you think just trying to play a devil's advocate in reverse, that is trying to find not his sins, but maybe his rationale, don't you think that the West, but specifically the US, misunderstood the end of the Cold War, not as a triumph of democracy, but basically as, to put it in simple terms, maybe not very healthy, what neither the Nazis nor the communists achieved, that is world domination, is for us. I mean, Marin Alvarez's doctrine of the indispensable nation, 99, Kosovo, 03, Iraq. Don't you think that Putin has hardened because of those experiences?
No. I would say that I didn't see any U.S. victory in my country becoming free. We had a victory. We became free. I didn't see it in no one in my country sees it in terms of U.S. hegemony. We like to be free. We like to have free and fair elections and freedom of speech and all those other good things. It was never in my country, and I live there, right? I mean, this is not, I mean, it's fine to say, oh, okay, with the U.S. expanding its influence. I don't think anyone sees the U.S. expanding its influence. Estonia wanted to get into NATO. The Czech Republic really wanted to get into NATO. Poland wanted to get into NATO. And this vision of NATO, the Americans expanded. Look, these are all democratically elected governments, and they won in elections by saying, we will go to NATO. I mean, they won the elections. I won the election by saying I'm going to work on getting into NATO. So, no.
And it's also worth noting that, I mean, Ukraine was never going to get into NATO. Well, it was not never, but was not easily going to get into NATO. And it was, in my experience, talking to people in NATO, no one ever said, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had Ukraine? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Yeah. Quite the opposite. They're thinking, oh my God, what kind of a nightmare would it be if we had to then deal with having Ukraine within NATO? These are political issues, which are it's often, it bubbles up from below rather than being imposed from above, in my experience.
I mean, same is true with the European Union, which is, I mean, you have people on the Maidan waving the European Union flag of Mary, and I mean, basically, I would say most countries were going, oh my God, we're not going to be able to absorb Ukraine. you know, I mean, there is a variety of opinion. I think Estonia is a country that's more pro-Ukrainian in this regard, and we think that, you know, having been part of the Soviet Union does not consign you forever to purgatory, and that if you do make effective reforms, and I mean, I think here, I'll just say right now, I mean, I think this is one of the problems with Ukraine, is that it needs to do far more in terms of reforms. I mean, if you look at the current Transparency International list, then of all post-communist countries, regardless, Soviet, East European, or elsewhere, Estonia has the lowest level of corruption, more or less at the same level as France and the United States. And there's a long, long way until you get to the next post-communist countries. You can, in fact, turn around. And unfortunately, one of the problems is that if we are sort of in this, we're number 26, you know, US 24 or something. I mean, I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but anyway, it's around there. Russia is 126 or 128, and Ukraine is 146. I mean, it's even, it has, again, this is a perceptions index. It's basically foreign investors' views of what is going on in the country and the problems they have with corruption. But the point is that, I mean, there's a lot that Ukraine really has to do in order to get into the European Union. Getting into NATO, I think that, I mean, I think these days, this way, countries that would immediately get into NATO in some other environment, say Finland, if they say, we'd like to join NATO. I have serious doubts if there aren't a number of countries in the European Union say, this isn't the right time, this isn't the right time, let's not do this, this might antagonize people. NATO, I mean, I think many Ukrainians would love to be in NATO. I think most Ukrainians would love to be in the European Union, but it, in fact, the sort of, there's no real will in Europe to really go and enlarge in either organization. And I think it's, we have to really jump through a lot of hoops in order to even make that a topic of discussion at the current moment. And it would become a topic of discussion if and only if we see major, major reform efforts, the kind that take 10, 15 years, and then success.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In the chap in the blue shirt here. Oh, sorry. Making you scamper.
Mr. President, good evening. You seem a most fascinating man. Can you tell us about your background and how you came to be the president of the country?
Well, everything has its internal logic, post hoc, propter, ergo propter hoc. But my parents were refugees, both people from Estonia, fled to Sweden. My father found out during the war his brother had been shipped as slave labor to Germany and made his way here, and we had a family reunion by they moved here, and I came with them, and I grew up in New Jersey, and I went to Columbia, and then I eventually ended up writing and ending up working at Radio Free Europe, and then when it became independent, I was one of the few people at the time who knew anything about foreign affairs that hadn't been educated in the Guillemot or the right or the KGB. So the president at the time asked me to come work for Estonia and said, you know, enough of good life in the West, come here. And then and I did, and then I was appointed ambassador to Washington, and then there was a crisis. I was appointed ambassador. I was appointed foreign minister. And then several years later, did that for two governments, and then I got, then the coalition collapsed. I was in Parliament, and then I ran for the European Parliament, and then in 2006, sort of a coalition. The Social Democrats, so center left, center right, and the moral equivalent of the FDP in Germany, as if I would run for president. And so and they said, "Don't worry, you won't win." But I did, and anyway, so that's how I got here.
can tell by the way that the speed of his speech increased that he loves talking about himself. Okay, we'll have another one on this side. Chap in the pale blue shirt.
I was trying to finish the answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
To get over it.
Mr. President, thank you for your talk today. Very revealing. We learned many things. However, the criticism you make of Russia, let's assume that it's right. It would speak bigger volumes as a criticism to those practices that are actually and you know the Western countries are engaging in, mainly the United States. So if Russia, let's say, is 1 times bad for doing the things it does, would you say that the US is like maybe 10 times worse?
Why is the United States
I'm referring, for example, you said changing of borders. Somebody mentioned Kosovo. We talked about the coup d'etat in Egypt, toppling the Muslim Brotherhood, the elected government in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's talk about the warmongering in Syria. Nobody had a problem with Assad for like so many decades. Why now? Is that a response because Iranophobia did not quite work? And then was Ukraine a payback because Putin did not budge for the attempts to topple like Assad? I mean, also, the last thing, I recently watched an advertisement of the US Navy. I mean, if we project it here, you would see how the US Navy bases are encroaching all over the world. I mean, would you find that like a little bit, I don't know, not suspicious, but kind of like irritating? I mean, come to Putin's position, and when you have all these bases, proliferating around the world, all over the world, that's a U.S. Navy ad campaign. I'm not making this up. Look it up. So, isn't Russia giving us a little bit of, isn't it like a mirror of what the U.S. mainly is doing? And we should look at Russia, and we should look, look back at our own doings. Okay?
I'm not American, but anyway, I mean, I sound like one, but
You sound like one, yes.
But what can I say? But I would say basically, I'm not here to defend the United States. I do like countries that are liberal democracies with orderly transfer of power through democratic elections and don't put people in jail for having the wrong opinion. So that sort of makes the United States a little more appealing to me. But I'm not here to defend the United States. I mean, the United States has, what do you have? You have, I guess, 200 times as many people as we do to do that. So don't ask me.
Okay, thank you. Right at the back, and then we'll swing around for some last questions over here.
Good evening, Mr. President. I had the honor to visit Estonia, Tallinn a few months ago, and I noticed there is a large population of Russians as well as in Latvia. And also while I was there, on the news I heard that the Russian airplanes were flying over the Norway's airspace, and that Poland was building some sort of towers or sensors on the border with Kaliningrad. Do you feel that the fact that there is such a large population, or such a large Russian population in Estonia, represents a threat or makes the Russian threat bigger to your country?
Well, as I said, it's getting bigger because the liberal Russians are moving to Estonia. So, I mean, I'm not so worried. I mean, I get this question a lot. So basically, I'll tell you frankly, if you're the best place to go to visit, talk to Russians is on the Russian border, and they see the reality of Russia. They look at their salaries. They look at what their compatriots get across the river. They get to travel anywhere or work anywhere in Europe, visa-free. There's no real worry about irredentism, separatism. Now, theoretically, the Russian government could instrumentalize this by making kind of like through an information works fake thing, but I mean, I think in general, the likelihood of that is fairly low. A different question, completely different question, is actually Russian behavior in the region, which causes us a lot of concern, not so much for military reasons, but it's kind of like an accident waiting to happen, because they have military flights where they turn off their transponders. And so civil aviation does not fly around with big radars. They're not AWACS planes. I mean, they know that there are other planes in the area only because of transponders that say, you know, plane in region. We've already had a number of really close near misses with Russian military aircraft that are flying in over the Baltic Sea, or over the Baltic Sea, you know, warned off by air traffic controllers saying, you know, turn hard right because you're going to have a crash. I mean, it's completely irresponsible to fly in international airspace in commercial airliner corridors without transponders. We have not gotten adequate response to this yet. And so it's an act for us. We see this as a major accident waiting to happen, and there is no justification for this. The only rationale is that we have a right not to put on our transponders. Well, this is not exactly indicative of sort of cooperative behavior, I would say, especially because the threats are to civilians.
Okay. Time for the last couple of questions, if you can keep them short. Chap in the pale blue shirt now.
How's it going? Thank you, Mr. President, for your comments. I'm curious if any thoughts either or both of you can share about the quality of the U.S. response to the challenges you've been talking about from Russia. Do you feel like this issue has gotten enough attention both inside and outside of government? Has it gotten enough of the right kind of attention? And would you expect to see any changes in U.S. policy as a result of a Republican or Democratic victory in the 2016 elections? Thanks.
I'll tell you, from an Estonian point of view, and I would say an East European point of view, and is that the U.S. has stepped up to the plate far more than anyone else in terms of commitment, rapid response. You know, I convened a National Security Council meeting on what is it, the 29th of February, after the 27th was the invasion of Crimea. It was decided then that we would ask for some under sort of basically NATO assistance. We went to the United States, and 90 hours later we had planes on our military airfield. Other NATO countries have been far, far slower. I mean, this was not a threat to us. This was just, we said, for reassurance. It would be nice if you could come in. So the U.S. has stepped up to the plate. I don't know what, I mean, I really can't comment on domestic politics, who would do more or less, but certainly compared to the rest of Europe, the rest of NATO, the United States stands far ahead of other countries. We are getting commitments from Germany and from the Netherlands. We do have air policing from countries like Spain and Italy and Hungary that have flown around, but basically there's nothing that I think anyone in Eastern Europe would say badly about the United States in this regard, because it's actually Europe that the continental people in NATO that have been far, far slower. I don't know what.
I mean, I think, again, I mean, in terms of as it kinetic or potentially kinetic response, absolutely. And likewise, if one looks at the sanctions regime, I mean, being essentially arrogant, there's obviously things I would have said, well, I don't think they should quite operate that way. I mean, I was a great fan of the early sanctions regime where they were targeting people much more than sort of systemic sanctions, and I think they should have done more of that on a more spiteful basis. But you know, but these are kind of quibbles. I think in general terms, I mean, it's crucial, I think, for me to say that from Moscow's point of view, they see everything as US-centric. I mean, they don't regard the European Union seriously.
Yeah.
And of course, I can understand why in this sort of thing.
You say there's a Brit.
Absolutely. In that context, I mean, I think that it was absolutely crucial that the United States was very much sort of there fast. And then, you know, whether or not the exact modality was the right one or whatever, doesn't matter. The point is it was actually that there was a US response quickly. That was absolutely crucial, because still from as far as the world from Moscow, or from the Kremlin Tower at least, there are two poles still to the world. And therefore everything matters on quite how Washington responds. Anyway, this is not about me, my views. One more question? Someone right here at the front? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to go back to the issue of Syria and whether you think the U.S. should continue kind of strenuously objecting to what the Russians are doing, whether we should kind of turn a blind eye to it, or whether we should actually actively cooperate with them in trying to defeat Daesh.
You mean turn a blind eye to what the Russians are doing in Ukraine?
No, I'm talking about Syria.
I don't know. The U.S. rarely asks me for foreign policy advice.
I mean, in terms of containing Russian power in the Middle East, which strategy would you think would be the most effective?
Well, I don't know if they have power in the Middle East. I mean, there's a fairly limited contingent in Tartus and the other place.
Latakia.
Latakia. So I don't really know what they're doing there. No one really knows what they're doing there. I mean, this is an offer that was put on the table, and again put on the table in today's speech. I don't really know. I mean, will they be effective? I think we discussed earlier that, I mean, this is probably not a place where we're going to see, or it would be in Putin's interest to have a major troop presence, because it's something which Russians generally don't want to be there. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on Syria and Assad. And it was not initially, what was interesting was it was not initially against ISIS, but against al-Nusra, which, I mean, not that they're that much better, but I mean, the point is that it was, now it's being recast as an Daesh or ISIS thing, but that was initially not the case. And in fact, if you look on the map, I mean, I'm really, again, not an expert on this, but, you know, my kind of like minor understanding is that, I mean, where the troops would go and where the presence is not, I mean, it's not where Daesh is. And of course, the Russians have been objecting to France going after ISIS, Daesh. And so today, listening about having to push back on ISIS was kind of a new thing for me, because up to now it's been defending the Assad regime against, well, I mean, sort of never who, but it was certainly where the action is for where the Russians are is against a different group than Daesh or ISIS or whatever you want to call it. But again, you know much more than that. You're the military guy.
Well, I mean, thank you. Though, I mean, no, the Estonians don't really sort of watch the Russian military that in any great detail or whatever. But no, I mean, you know,
Radic remark, or?
Of course. Again, as you said, I'm a Brit, therefore you should assume that most things I say are essentially ironic. But I mean, at the moment, the Russian commitment is what, 24 fighter bombers and essentially base support and security contingent. And frankly, just keeping those going, given that they're having to do it by airlift or fairly long circuitous sea lift, is going to be problematic. Modern warfare is incredibly voracious in terms of ammunition, fuel, all the other sort of the boring stuff behind the front line. This is not the kind of deployment that in any way is going to reshape the battlefield. If the Russians really want to make a difference, they're going to have a massive commitment. Yeah. A commitment that they can neither afford nor actually have.
It's like Kamran Bey, actually, you know, or you know, sort of, 500,000 troops. I mean, they don't have 500,000 troops.
Exactly. So I think at the moment, I mean, although tempting it would be to call his bluff and say, fair enough, well, we'll just let you get away with, go ahead. Destroy Islamic State. You go for it. Because as we know, you can always bomb insurgencies to defeat. They never end up sort of recruiting more people. You never end up bombing the wrong people. You never end up leveling cities in the process or whatever. And we know with the ruthless precision and accuracy and humanitarian impulses for which the Russian Air Force is so well known.
Especially in Grozny.
It would go swimmingly. I mean, but so despite that snarky temptation, I think when it comes down to it, I mean, it is the Russians can really offer little, except just simply a token that just someone says, we can cause some mischief. I mean, this has always been the Russian strategy, is to basically, and again, if we go back to the sort of mobster metaphor, it's the nice China we got here. Shame if a bull happened to turn up, but I can keep the bull out. That's basically the best that Russia can offer.
God, you're a Brit, but you sound Estonian.
Well, that's a fine compliment to end this. I know you have to zoom off. You're on a very tight timetable. We very greatly appreciate you carving out some time in what is, after all, a very busy week. Amidst all the other sort of great things, I'm sure that speaking to an NYU audience is a high point of any visit or whatever. Toomas Ilves, thank you very much indeed for your time.
I also wanted to thank you, and I would say if you don't follow Professor Galeotti, he's one of the smartest persons I know on this whole subject, and I don't know how regularly you're on the power vertical fairly often, but if anyone has any interest in following Russia, then Fridays, Saturdays, the power vertical, rferl.org, and Professor Galeotti is often there with the most incisive comments. So, a little commercial break from Estonia.
Yeah, and we love it.